Well, good morning again. If you would, take your Bible and open it to John, the Gospel of John, chapter number 18. John, chapter number 18. We are going to walk through a lot of verses of Scripture this morning as we deal in whole with the trials of Jesus. There are really about 6 of them, so that should give you some perspective on how much ground we will cover. But we'll kind of sum them up into 3 different categories this morning. So John chapter number 18, thought to myself, how many times during these trials did Jesus have to remind himself that God had good plans for him? God had good plans for him. If anybody understood what it was like to deal with struggles and suffering, certainly our Lord knows more than we do what it's like to overcome this world with the power of God. John chapter number 18. As I was reading and processing through the trials of Jesus, I came across this old legend that tells of an Irish king who disguised himself and went into the banquet hall of one of his barons. He was escorted to a lowly place among the tables at the feast, but the brilliance of his conversation and the nobility of his manner soon attracted the attention of someone with sufficient authority to escort him to a higher table than where he was. The same thing occurred again, and then it happened again, and then it happened again, and soon he was seated among the nobles of the realm. After another display of great wisdom, one of the lords spoke out. Here's what he said: "In truth, sir, you speak like a king. If you are not a king, you deserve to be one." Then the king removed his disguise and took his rightful place among his subjects. I was reading that old legend and I thought to myself as I was processing through the trials of Jesus, at some point during one of those trials, this is what should have happened. At some point, someone should have noticed that this guy really is more than maybe what we thought he was. That's what should have happened with Jesus. After hearing his teachings and witnessing his miracles and perceiving his wisdom and discovering his love and his compassion, it should have been obvious that this was the man that was promised to be both Messiah and King. In those moments, he should have been elevated to the highest seat at the highest table. Yet, here's what we know. That's not what happened with Jesus. Now, as we read through the trials of Jesus, as they are told to us in the Gospel of John, and even with the help of the other gospel writers, I want us to do something a little different this morning. Typically, we read these accounts and we're tempted just to think about the historical information that we're receiving. Now listen, it's certainly true. The trials happened. Jesus was dragged from one group to the next to have his perfect life examined by sinful men. But this morning, I want us to take the trials of Jesus a little bit more personal. I want us to do what pretty much everyone in these trials had to do. And I want us to ask ourselves a simple question this morning. As we walk through these trials, I want you to think, if you were there, if you were one of these leaders, if you were one of these people, what will I do with Jesus? If that was me, if I had been there, what would I have done with Jesus? But even more personal than that time, I want you to think about you right now. As the question surfaces over and over and over again, I want you to ask yourself, what will I do with Jesus? Now listen, I want to run through this as quickly as we possibly can, and we've got a lot of information that we are going to cover. The first trial that I want to talk about is what I call the trial before priests. The trial before priests. What would his own people do with him? Now, this trial takes place really in 3 different settings, and so I want to highlight them for just a moment. The first one is Jesus before a guy by the name of Annas. Jesus before Annas. It's found in John chapter 18, starting with verse 19. Let's pick up there. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. And Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said." And when he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand. He punched him in the face, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" And Jesus answered him, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" Now I want to pause Because the high priest that's mentioned here in John chapter 18 is not the actual high priest. We know from the context of the Gospel of John that the high priest is actually a guy by the name of Caiaphas. However, the man that's referred to here as the high priest is the former high priest by the name of Annas. He's the father-in-law of the current high priest, which is Caiaphas. And you say, Danny, how do we know this? Well, it comes in John chapter 18, verse 12. If you look back at it, after Jesus is arrested, it says, so the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and they bound him. First, they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. Now, there's a lot of debate on why he's brought to Annas and why Annas is considered the high priest, even though he isn't. There are different reasons. One could be that the Sanhedrin needed a little bit more time to get convened, and so they brought him to Annas because he was such a highly respected leader. And because he had served for so many years as the high priest, he still kind of kept that title as a respected title among his own people. Also, if he is so respected, not just by his own people, the Jews, but also by the Romans, then a charge that's brought from Annas would carry a lot of weight once the Sanhedrin did get together and begin to place Jesus on trial. Now, regardless of why Annas is considered the high priest, there are several things that are wrong that are happening in these verses. Not only is Jesus being falsely accused, arrested, and tried, but he's also given an illegal trial. Now, for us, reading this account, we don't pick up on this because we're not Jews and we're not familiar with what's known as the Mishnah. The Mishnah is a collection of Jewish laws. But if you were familiar with the Mishnah, then you would know exactly what a criminal trial would look like for the Jewish people. And it's not what Jesus is experiencing. One of these is no trials were to occur during the night hours or before the morning sacrifice. Well, we know that's happening with Jesus. Trials were not to occur on the eve of a Sabbath or during festivals. We know that's happening with Jesus. All trials were to be public. Secret trials were forbidden. And trials were to be held in the hall of judgment in the temple area. That's not what's happening here with Jesus. The high priest shouldn't participate in the questioning. However, that's happening here with Jesus. An accused person cannot testify against himself. Rather, someone was required to speak on behalf of the accused. But here's Jesus making a response for himself, trying to plead his own case. Also, brutality wasn't permitted in a typical trial in their day. In fact, it's not typically allowed in a trial today either. Could you imagine if instead of, judge, I object, or could you imagine if it was ruled out of order, instead of that being the way that a courtroom was addressed? What if instead a soldier, a guard, just walked over across the room and punched you in the mouth when you said something you weren't supposed to? It would keep you from saying more things that you weren't supposed to, but that's not exactly how we conduct business, right? In a civilized group of people. And so obviously that wasn't the case when it came to Jesus either. Yet all of these things are broken when it came to the trial of Christ. Now, it may seem like when you're reading this, Jesus seems like a jerk. The high priest is addressing him. Why is Jesus not more kind? But once you know the context of how they legally would go about a trial, Jesus is not being a jerk. He's just simply appealing to their laws. Hey, here's how you normally do a trial. Why would you address me? Why would it be in the middle of the night? Why are you doing this unjustly when a trial should actually be this way? And so Jesus is calling out the things that they're doing wrong in an illegal trial happening in a way that it should not happen. He simply says, bear witness if what I'm saying or doing is wrong. But he didn't say anything wrong. Jesus never did any wrong. He was perfect, and so punishment would be fine. He would take it if he was wrong, but he wasn't. He wants them to go about their legal precedent. He wants them to do things as they were governed to do. But we know it's clear from the beginning that this isn't a trial, it's a sentencing. John's highlighting how wrong this fake trial really was because Jesus never stood a chance. Now listen to me, Annas had to deal with Jesus. He had to answer this question, what will I do with Jesus? And so he does, and he sends him to Caiaphas. This is the next part of the trial before priests. It's seen in verse 24 of John chapter 18. Jesus before Annas, now Jesus before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. Look at verse 24. Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So now, though he was not with the high priest before, even though the people thought of Annas as the high priest, now he is before the high priest. So you can see some faulty judgment that's happening anyway. The goal was never to examine Jesus. The goal was always to exterminate Jesus. And so we see it in this false trial. Now, John doesn't tell us about Jesus' appearance before Caiaphas. He doesn't give us a lot of the details there with the Sanhedrin that night, but Matthew and Mark do. And their accounts, though we're not going to read them, also show us the unjust nature of the trial. Once again, it's at night, and it couldn't be. It should have been, or it shouldn't have been. It should have been in public. There are witnesses at this next trial, which is good, but they're false witnesses. Witnesses for the prosecution were to be examined and cross-examined extensively. Conviction required the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses to be in perfect alignment. We know that they're not. In fact, Mark tells us in Mark 14, now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. We know that it was false, yet they still took it. There were witnesses against Jesus, but there were not any witnesses allowed to speak on behalf of Jesus. And so the laws are still being broken. Once again, the high priest questions Jesus directly, which, by the way, wasn't allowed. And then there's the sentencing for Jesus. It also violated many of the Jewish laws. Verdicts in capital cases were to be handed down only during daylight hours. The members of the Sanhedrin were to meet in pairs all night, discuss the case, and then reconvene for the purpose of confirming the final verdict and imposing sentence. Sentencing in a capital case was not to occur until the following day, but this is not the case with Jesus. No, if you read the accounts in Matthew and Mark, here's what you discover. The high priest questions Jesus falsely at night, right? They bring these witnesses that are liars, and then instead of convening or reconvening after they've had time to talk it over in pairs, they don't do that. Instead, they appoint his sentencing right then and there. The high priest says, we've heard enough. We can make a decision right now. In fact, here's what they did in Matthew 26. What is your judgment? And they answered, he deserves death. And then listen, instead of spending the night talking about what should happen with Jesus and actually going through their proper laws in capital cases, that's not what they do. Here's what they do. They spit in his face and struck him. And some slapped him, saying, prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you? Guess what's happening? Just like Annas, Caiaphas, and the Sanhedrin, they had to answer the question, what would we do with Jesus? And then we see Jesus before the public. Now, John doesn't mention the third decision that's made in this trial. After the religious leaders illegally put Jesus on trial in the middle of the night, twice, by the way, they finally bring him publicly before their people. Now, the moment is only mentioned briefly in the other gospel accounts, even though John doesn't mention it. Here's how Mark puts it in Mark 15. And as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and they led him away and they delivered him over to Pilate. So around 6 o'clock in the morning, the high priest summoned the council to the official place of judgment. This was a semicircular hall at the east end of the royal portico of the temple. This place was designed to resemble a threshing floor. Now, in ancient times, farmers met at the place where wheat was separated from chaff in order to sort truth from evil. It was at the threshing floor where all matters of justice were decided before the entire community. Now, the trial at this point in time takes place in the light of day. It's finally in the proper venue, and it is finally before the eyes of the public, but they're still breaking their own laws when they sentence him on the same day that he is tried. You see, their purpose was not to uncover the truth, but to find a charge that would satisfy a very specific set of requirements. Here's what we know. They've been planning to kill Jesus for weeks. Just go back to John chapter 11 and you'll see their scheming beginning. So here we are. What would Annas do? What would Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin do? What would the people do with Jesus? He was betrayed, arrested, falsely accused, abused by his own people, yet Jesus never fought back. He never sought freedom. Though he was innocent, he endured the pain for the plan and the promise of God. The trial before priests was pretty ugly. They clearly made their decision on what they would do with Jesus. What was it? They sent him to Pilate. That's our next trial. Number 2, the trial before Pilate. Listen, like the trial before priests, the trial before Pilate also has 3 separate settings. Here's the first one. I like to call it Jesus before Pilate part 1. It's very clever, right? I came up with that on my own. John chapter 18, verse 28. Look at it with me. Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. That's where Pilate would be staying. That's where any of the governors would be staying. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. Now pause for a moment. They wanted to make sure that they were still right with God. So they didn't enter a Gentile's quarters because that would make them not right with God anymore. They'd be defiled, but yet they would kill the Son of God. See the irony that John's building? So Pilate, verse 29, went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" And they answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." That sounds kind of smart, doesn't it? Pilate said to them, "Fine. Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." And the Jews said to him, "It's not lawful for us to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what death he was going to die. Now, can you see the bickering a little bit that's going on? This is the relationship that Pilate and the Jews have with one another. You don't see this necessarily from the context of the Gospels, but if you know anything about Jewish history at this point in time, you know Pilate and the Jews have a long list of history. He has over and over and over again betrayed their traditions and went against what they like to do. And over again, they had rioted and even died because of their beliefs in God so that they could overthrow Pilate. And so over and over, back and forth, this is their relationship. So the Jews are a little smart with him. They're like, you know what? Why would we have brought him here if there wasn't an issue? And then Pilate's a little smart back. Well, then fine, go deal with it yourself, right? But they know they couldn't. No. They've got another issue, right? They've revealed the problem that they have. They needed Pilate's authority to execute Jesus. This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken. Jesus knew that he would die. He knew the Jews would have to get the Romans to do it. Therefore, he knew he wouldn't be stoned to death. That was the Jewish death sentence. No, rather, he would be crucified, which was the Roman death sentence. This is not the first time. We shouldn't be surprised by the crucifixion. Jesus talked about it back in John chapter 3. He said, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up." He's talking about the cross. John chapter 8, so Jesus said to them, "When you have lifted up the Son of Man, you will know that I am he." He's talking about the cross. John chapter 12, "And when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." He's talking about the cross. In fact, Isaiah talked about it way before Jesus did in Isaiah 53:5. "But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed." Jesus chose to die on a cross for you and for me. And so look at verse 33. Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" And Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew?" Of course he didn't say it. "Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." That's a little confusing. Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king." See the confusion? And Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world." Here it is, to bear witness to the truth. "Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." And Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And after he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him." Now I want you to process this moment with me. The Jews wanted to kill Jesus because he was claiming to be God. But the accusation of blasphemy wasn't enough for Pilate to sentence a man to death. He didn't care about Jewish tradition. That wasn't enough. At this point, the Jews had to convince Pilate that Jesus was a threat to the throne. They had to convince him that he was a threat to Rome. Here's how Luke put it in chapter 23, verse 2. "And they began to accuse him, saying, 'We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king.'" So Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He needs to know if Jesus really is a threat. Now, we're not Jews, so our title of our discussion this morning, "Are you the king of the pews?" Because I think the same way in which Pilate was mocking a Jewish king, it's the same way the world will look at the people in these pews and mock Jesus today. I wonder if Pilate thought that this entire question was a little silly, What kind of king would be poor, have a small following of nobodies, and be so easily captured? Pilate likely knew that there was something else at work here, but why did they hate this man so much? Well, to be honest, the answer to Pilate's question is extremely complicated. Are you the king of the Jews? Well, Jesus is certainly a king. We know that. He's the King of Kings. But he's not a king in the sense of an earthly king. He's not developing an army to overthrow the Roman Empire. No. Listen, earthly kingdoms are built on military might and intellectual prowess and political cunning and financial abundance and social advantage. But that's not what Jesus is doing. No, his kingdom is a heavenly kingdom. It's not from the world. His kingdom is built on something different. It's built on the truth. He is a king. The arrival of the Messiah on that lonely Bethlehem night was absolutely an invasion. He was building a kingdom, but it's not of this world, yet it would certainly change everything. What Jesus says to Pilate is the same thing every person must respond to. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. Every person must decide if they will live in obedience to this world, this earthly kingdom, or if they will live in obedience to the truth, Jesus' kingdom. Pilate had to decide what would he do with Jesus. Now listen, Jesus informs Pilate not to worry about the Roman Empire. Jesus wasn't raising up an army to overthrow their kingdom. No, his kingdom was built on truth, not on power. His followers weren't looking for a physical war. If they were, they would have been fighting for his release. However, his fight isn't against the Roman Empire. It's not against a worldly empire. He's not fighting a physical war, but a spiritual one. And the cross that Pilate would sentence Jesus to would be the very instrument that brought victory. Now, clearly in Pilate's mind, the wheels are turning. This is why he looks at him and says, "What is truth?" You see, Jesus claims truth as his foundation instead of power. How foreign is this to the mind of Pilate? How foreign is this to the minds of our world today? People don't succeed in this world by truth, no. They succeed by compromising truth in order to advance their own kingdom. You with me? Jesus gives Pilate a choice. You can compromise truth and advance your status in the kingdom of this world, or you can walk in truth and receive unseen rewards in God's kingdom. This is why Jesus said, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." But that's not what Pilate decides to do. He doesn't embrace Jesus, though he's unwilling to kill him. He finds no guilt in him, but he finds no reason to follow either. So he devises a plan to get himself off the hook. This is what I like to call Jesus before Herod. This is the next setting in the trial before Pilate. Now, John doesn't mention this trial, but Luke does. In Luke chapter 23, we discover that after the people tell Pilate that Jesus is actually from Galilee, Pilate has an idea. Oh, wait a second. If he's a Galilean, then that's not my jurisdiction, right? I need to go find Herod because Herod needs to deal with this problem. So he does. He finds Herod. And guess what? Herod is very glad. He desired to meet Jesus. He had heard about him. He was hoping to see something incredible that Jesus could do. He'd heard about the miracles. He'd heard about the teachings. He'd heard about this incredible man by the name of Jesus. He was ruling Galilee during Jesus' life. Of course he heard about Jesus. And so he's excited. He wants to hear him, and he questioned him at length, but Jesus gave no answer. And so here's what happened. The chief priests and the scribes, they stood by vehemently accusing him, and Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him and arrayed him in splendid clothing, probably his own kingly garments, and sent him back to Pilate. Pilate thinks he's good. He sends him to Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great, the current ruler of Galilee. And like all others before him, like Annas, like Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, like the Jewish people, like Pilate, Herod has to answer a simple question: what will he do with Jesus? And Herod's decision is quick. He makes a mockery of Jesus, sends him back to Pilate, dressed in his own kingly robes, likely mocking him, claiming Jesus to be a false king. And then we have what I like to call Jesus before Pilate, part 2. You're like, Danny, this is a lot. I know, look at verse 39. I'm ignoring you telling me it's a lot. John 18, verse 39. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews? And they cried out again, not this man, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a robber. That's a little note that John gives us. If you read the other gospel accounts, you find even more disturbing things out about the life of Barabbas. But here's Pilate, right? Robber could probably be better translated as the word terrorist. He fought against both the Romans and the Jews, and so everybody wanted Barabbas to die. So Pilate's thinking, okay, if I can't wash my hands of Jesus by sending him to Herod and letting Herod deal with him, all right, then how about this? I will give someone so terrible up to be freed that the people will have to choose to free Jesus. And once again, my hands will be clean, but they don't. The plan backfires. The people choose Barabbas. Here's where Pilate is stuck. You don't know this, but we know it from history. Pilate's already got several strikes against him from the emperor Tiberius. Tiberius knows, Pilate knows, if one more bad thing happens and he can't keep it under control, he's out. He loses everything. He loses his career, his livelihood, his job, his family no longer gets the governor's headquarters. Everything for him is at stake. He's got to figure out a way. What can I do with Jesus? He knows that he'll be risking all of it. You see, Pilate could choose Jesus and lose his power, or he could choose power and lose Jesus. What would Pilate do with Jesus? And so if you think he doesn't have another plan, he still does. Herod didn't work out. Barabbas backfired. So he gets one more plan together. It's found in John chapter 19, starting in verse 1. Check out the next plan. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. This is the next plan. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. And they came to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him with their hands. And Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." This was the next plan. Pilate makes one last attempt to release Jesus, though it would come at a great cost. He flogs Jesus. Now, just to put this in proper perspective, Jesus in this moment is led to the Roman garrison adjacent to the temple, and he's given to an expert in torture called a lictor. The lictor used a whip with long leather tails called a flagrum, or what we might better know as the cat of nine tails. The leather straps could be merely knotted, or if the lictor wanted to inflict more damage, he could choose a whip with small metal weights or even bits of sheep bone braided into the straps. The iron balls would cause deep contusions, and the leather straps and the sheep bones would cut into the skin. Then as the flogging continued, the lacerations would tear into the underlying skeletal muscles and produce ribbons of bleeding flesh. According to a forensic pathologist, the scourging typically resulted in rib fractures and severe lung bruises and lacerations with bleeding into the chest cavity and partial or complete collapsing of the lungs. The lictor was an expert in the art of torture, and he knew exactly how to beat a man within an inch of his life. Vital organs would be exposed as the flesh tore from the body. As a matter of fact, most didn't even survive the flogging. In between lashings, the soldiers took delight in mocking Jesus. The Romans despised the Jews and vice versa. So the idea that the Jews would have a king was laughable to them. How could this scum of the earth have a king? The fact that their king would actually be simple and poor made their jokes even more fun. That was the picture they had of all Jews. And so they placed an intensely painful crown of thorns on his head since he was a king, and they draped a kingly robe on him. The thorns themselves, by the way, are a sign of the curse of sin upon the world, because that's what Jesus wore. And they taunted him, and they hit him, and then they sent him back to Pilate. And here's what Pilate thinks. He thinks this extreme torture will be enough to satisfy the bloodthirsty mob. After all, how could they see Jesus completely maimed by this point, with blood running down his face, being able to literally count his ribs, with crowns of thorns on his head? How could they not look at him and go, "This is enough"? But it wasn't enough. You see, this is what our sin does to Jesus. It always takes more. And once again, Pilate's faced with this question: What would he do with Jesus? And then there's the last trial. I'm done. This is what I like to call the trial before people. It's found in the next few verses of John chapter 19. Let me read them to you. I'm going to start in verse number 6. When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, even with all that had already happened to him, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, take him yourself and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. Once again, he's trying to get out, but he can't. And the Jews answered him, we have a law, and according to the law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God. And so Pilate's got to make a decision. He's got to decide, will I lose everything or will I give him Jesus? And so when Pilate heard this statement, when he heard that statement that he has made himself the Son of God, he was even more afraid. And he entered his headquarters again and he said to Jesus, where are you from? At this moment, Pilate's finally realizing this dude is more than what I thought. Who are you? Where are you from? Tell me something. I need something to set you free. But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said, you will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you or authority to crucify you? And Jesus answered him, I love it. You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. Pilate's trying, man. He's pulling at all the straws. He doesn't want Jesus to die, not because he believes in him, but because he knows it's wrong. But he's not willing to give up all the things that benefit him for this man. He's not willing to. I wonder how many people are the same way in this room. You're not willing to give it for Jesus. You're asking too much. I won't give you my life. That's where Pilate is. And Jesus is like, look, man, this is bad. But it's worse for those, my people, who know all these things and still refuse to obey them. It's worse for the people who have my very word memorized and still don't recognize me. So once again, Pilate has another opportunity to submit to God, but he doesn't. Instead, it says in verse 12, from then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. And so when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out, sat down on the judgment seat at the place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. And now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. By the way, this is when the Passover lambs would be slaughtered. This is very fitting for the Passover lamb to be slaughtered. And he said to the Jews, behold your king. And they cried out, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? And the chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus. Still Pilate seeking a way. But he knew he wouldn't give it all up for Jesus. And so what does he do? He gives him to the people. Listen, make no mistake, each of us are faced with the same decision. Will we seek advancement in this kingdom or in God's kingdom? As the people cried for Barabbas over Jesus, all people face a similar choice. Will we choose this world? Will we choose Barabbas? Or will we choose Jesus? Pilate tried to figure out a way to have the best of both kingdoms, but he couldn't, and neither can we. At the end of the day, each of us must choose, what will we do with Jesus? It's a beautiful old hymn that's written by a guy named Albert B. Simpson. It was written back in 1905. The title of the hymn is, What Will You Do with Jesus? Listen to the words that he wrote. Jesus is standing in Pilate's hall, friendless, forsaken, betrayed by all. Hearken what meaneth the sudden call. What will you do with Jesus? Jesus is standing on trial still. You can be false to him if you will. You can be faithful through good or ill. What will you do with Jesus? Will you evade him as Pilate tried, or will you choose him whate'er betide? Vainly you struggle from him to hide. What will you do with Jesus? Will you, like Peter, your Lord deny, or will you scorn from his foes to fly, daring for Jesus to live or die? What will you do with Jesus? Jesus, I give thee my heart today. Jesus, I'll follow thee all the way. Gladly obeying thee, will you say, this I will do with Jesus. What will you do with Jesus? Neutral you cannot be. Someday your heart will be asking, what will he do with me? Whew. Friends, the trial is a fascinating moment. There are plenty of things that we can look at in all the broken laws and all the opportunities and all the terrible things that were done to Jesus. But can I just give you a thought this morning? They're not the only ones who have to answer the question, what will I do with Jesus? No, friend, that's each of us in the room this morning. You see, we think about Jesus being on trial historically 2,000 plus years ago. Of course we do. It did. It happened. But what we often don't think about is that Jesus is still on trial today. I'm not talking about he's walking down the road and being beaten and carrying his cross. I'm not talking about being scourged and whipped. I'm not talking about climbing up there again and being nailed. No, that already happened. Jesus died for the sins of the world. Praise God. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the hearts of every person that's never made a decision to follow Jesus. You are still at the same crossroads that they were at then. The question still presents itself. As you know what you know about Jesus, what will you do with him? Listen to me. Will you crown him or will you crucify him? That's the question. What will you do with Jesus? Because listen, you can either crown yourself and crucify Jesus, or you can crucify yourself and crown Jesus. I wonder if there's somebody in the room today who says, Danny, I'm at that crossroad right now. Jesus is on trial in my own life, in my own heart, and I don't know either. Danny, I'm there. Well, friend, let me tell you something. In just a moment, I'm going to pray, and I'm going to go stand in that lobby. And if that's you, I'd love for you to come find me, and I'll take my Bible, and I'll tell you exactly what Jesus did for you so that right now, today, you can answer the question, what will I do with Jesus? And if you are in that crossroads, listen to me, and you don't come find me, you're still answering the question of what you'll do with Jesus. Making a decision or not making a decision is still a decision. Friend, where are you when it comes to Jesus? Hey, listen, I bet there's a lot of other people in the room though, and you think, well, Danny, I've already made that decision. Well, friend, let me tell you something. That don't mean that every day you don't have moments where Jesus is on trial in your own life. Say, Danny, what are you talking about? When you make that decision at work to honor Jesus or not, he's on trial. When you make that decision with your family, whether to honor Jesus or not, he's on trial. When you make that decision at school, whether or not I'll honor Jesus, he's on trial. Hey, friend, every day we get to walk in obedience to truth, or we get to walk building a kingdom of our own on this earth. Friend, which will you choose? You've got the opportunity today. Will you crucify him or will you crown him? Friend, can I just remind you of something? He is, in fact, the king of the pews. You know what that means? He's your king and he's mine. What will you do with Jesus?